authored by René Brouwer and Mirek Dimitrov. Solidarity and the Kafkaesque administrative apparatus of the university. René is with us, Mirek is not, but still, we really look forward for the Kafka style.
Have a program script, so I do know what I'm talking about, so I'm not completely lost. So there is content, just not visual content. So that's why I put up the images here, just to have something on the screen more than. So this presentation stems from a collaboration between myself and my colleague Mirek Dimitrov. And the purpose of this presentation for us is not so much that we want to provide contextual examples of pedagogy, research funding, and impact generation, where the issues that we have identified with the bureaucratic dynamic manifest, but rather to test and think through collectively the very dynamic, its consequences, and what the potential solutions might be to what we have identified and want to present here. As far as we understand it, there's a central conflict at the heart of this presentation. And this conflict is between the administrators/managers and the academics. And it's being fought over the bureaucracy. And in principle, the administrators/managers ought to support and enable the academics. In practice, it is very often that the academics de facto work for the administrators and managers. We want to address this in three parts. Firstly, we want to look at the technology of administration as a little closer. Secondly, we want to unpack what type of issues might occur in the process and why. And lastly, we want to widen the view and address some potential solutions of how to address some of these issues and their wider consequences. Next slide. So the heading was, what is a form? I'm sure I'm not, telling you any. We all have seen a form, so we can visualize what a form is like. So what do we mean by that? Before we can answer the question, let's briefly look at this administrative form a little closer. A form is a disciplinary mechanism. It's a technology that orders and structures the information flow in a certain predetermined fashion to operationalize a specific desired outcome. In principle, this is neutral, as this technology can be used for all different types of purposes. In practice, there's a power differential between the individual who provides the form and the individual that is being asked to fill in the form. Next slide. And the heading would be here, street-level bureaucrats. And here the idea of a street-level bureaucrat we think is helpful. And this is an idea from a guy called Michael Lipsky. And he says it is these individuals who are at the phase of policy implementation. So now we have this form, which is our technology that structures the information flow. And now we have this specific policy brief that is created that manifestation of this for the form for the specific purpose. And we now apply this to scholarship, research funding, impact generation. It doesn't really matter. The dynamic is still the same. Here, when we also have the individual administrator who's now helping the academics to fill in the form. However, as much as they are intending to help, they may in practice also hinder. It all depends on the context of the interaction. However, from the viewpoint of the administrator, this is all just a routine bureaucratic exercise because they filled in that form 1,000 times, 100 times. But if we were now jumping the fence to the other side, so here is the street level bureaucrat, and here is the individual that is getting bureaucratized and, information. So from the other side, there's nothing routine about this at all. The academic needs to pass a crushingly complex reality into an adherence to that particular form. Furthermore, the more routine this supposedly is, the more difficult it becomes for the academic to voice protest that this particular form is not well suited for their specific work task, which may or may not be the case. Unfortunately, from the side of the street-level bureaucrat, they now potentially only see someone that is refusing to fill in their form correctly. And depending upon the specific administrator in question, they then become a de facto gatekeeper. In real terms, this means that the cognitive limitations of the administrator in understanding the specific contextual situation become the limiting pressure if the task is filled incorrectly or not. If the academic issue with filling in the form is perceived as a struggle to fill in the form, or an act of insubordination or refusal, or whatever the reason is, as the outcome of these both contingency is that the form is not filled incorrectly. So next slide. So why does this matter? What's the consequences of that? Surely by now you're asking yourself, what we all know this. Why are you telling me this? We all need to fill in forms, and yes, we're all aware that this is annoying and that there can be problems, and so what? What you want to draw out here is that the specific consequence of what happens in a research context, then there isn't yet an established consensus if it is refusal, if it is complexity, whatever the reason is, because, well, it's research. We don't know. It's new. It can be all these things. In order to draw out this dimension, let's revisit the idea that the form is a technology. And here I had a wonderful quote from Arthur C. Clarke: "Any sufficient advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Because when the form is filled in correctly, the mechanization of the university institution are set in motion. And from the perspective of the academic and an outsider that doesn't understand how the internal mechanizations work, it might as well be magic. Because what happens at the end is resources appear. You get money to go to a conference, you get funding applications or whatever. But the specific details of what happened, you're not aware of that as an academic. So here was then now a picture of like a magic spell. And here we now want to invite you to think of a form filling as a temporal process as well. That starts off with identifying a strategy and ideas that should be put into the form. These might be bullet points jotted down from a conversation that identifies the correct narrative, which to put into these boxes. The next step might be to expand these talking points into prose. A funding application is a good example here. Let's say there's a box, and as there increasingly are, and that says, how is this research going to impact society? No matter how you twist and turn this box, anything that goes into that box is going to be a speculation, because you're talking about the future. You're talking about things that have not yet manifested. So it's a spell. It's an enchantment that you're putting in there, and if you correctly, then you have bewitched the institution in order to get these resources. The next slide: the restrictions of thinking. Now, how difficult or easy it is for research to influence society depends on the context and the subject matter of the specific research. For example, someone researching on cancer might have a very clear vision of how they intend to influence society, and for that it's easier to make that claim of benefit. Meanwhile, someone who is specialized in early modern British history, for example, might find that box somewhat daunting, of saying of how your research is going to influence and change society. It is not to say that both individuals can or cannot generate impact. They may very well do. However, the time spans and the level of complexity, the specific context of the application, and so on and so forth, all of these factors play a role. Here, the template, and I don't mean the form, I mean the mental template that is usually departed from the position of the administrator, helping to fill in the form, is their popular understanding of science. They have a mental schemata of how research ought to work. But they are not the experts in research. That's what the researchers, the academics are. But that mental schemata, maybe from an undergraduate course that they had, and maybe from a specific science documentaries that they watch on television, or their working experience with working in a specific, like, small disciplinary context of where they're going. So, next slide. The role of university organization. But Renee and Mirek, come on, back off. This is precisely the reason of why you have professional administrative staff that are specialized in a particular discipline so that they can help the academics to their best of their ability. But is this really the case for all academics? First of all, there is a management tendency to centralize staff in the universities, as this is more cost effective. But what this cost calculation here doesn't necessarily have to align with is what is best for a specific academic context. Because it's a normalization and every research project is individual. It has their own complexities. As such, having several administrators all sourced out at different faculties is more expensive than a central team of staff, of career administrators that can help everyone equally and professionally. Here we argue that the very centralization becomes a problem. If we now return to the open question of what correct means, and we want to think about what correct to whom. And here the slide says Weber, not Kafka. So let's finally turn to Kafka. The specific metaphor of Kafka that we want to evoke here is that of the cockroach. In other words, of how the mechanization of the bureaucratic apparatus turn people into cockroaches. We would argue it's precisely the process of using forms that reduce complexity that this becomes a process of dehumanization. By not allowing people the freedom to express themselves and the time for that expression to manifest on their own premises, it creates these negative emotional associations. I like this quote from Weber here, and this is from his essay of Science of Vocation, and I have switched one word where it says youth, but I put in the administrators, managers. So let me read that quote for you. Nowadays, in circles of administrators/managers, there is a widespread notion that science has become a problem in calculation, fabricated in laboratories or statistically fill-in systems, just as in a factory. A calculation involving only the cool intellect and not one's heart and soul. First of all, one must say that such a comment lacks all clarity about what goes on in a factory or in a laboratory. In both, some idea has to occur to someone's mind, and it has to be a correct idea if one is to accomplish anything worthwhile. And such intuition cannot be forced. It has nothing to do with any cold calculation. And that was written 100 years ago. So where we want to take this is that this seems to be us the incredulity, the influence of the administrator, influence on knowledge production, and how they become enablers or stumbling blocks to scientific research is an area of research that has yet not been fully appreciated and explored in what it does to academic hierarchies, what it does to consensus making, and all of these things. So the next slide was the devil's advocate. For narrative purposes, and in order to have a cool and catchy conference title, we use the word Kafkaesque because it's a cool word, and it does encapsulate this dynamic that we want to draw out very well. So it's wonderful. Furthermore, the narrative structure so far of presenting the administrator as these mindless obstructors to knowledge production and the poor academics that suffer the whims of the university administration and management is not only something that many academics can find recognition in, it also fits a simplistic narrative schemata of perpetrator and victim. And it makes a nice story. I was just able to convey something, and there was some recognition. However, let us be clear. Nothing could be further from the point that we're trying to make here. Instead, we see these spheres of university conduct, administrators, pedagogy, research, outreach, impact, so on and so forth. They are all in a synergistic relationship. Only by working through their dissonances can we identify what are and are not genuine issues in order to find a solution. So, next slide would be solution and problem perception. While it is simpler for us to claim that we want to find solution, it is even simpler to acknowledge that we all want to find practical solution. However, such process is encumbered if we don't even know what the problem is. Like I was saying, the only thing that is perceivable is that the form is not filled in correctly. This is not an abstract issue, but a reality for form filling in general. For example, from the perspective of the administrators, they have filled in 100 forms that specific issue for their work test, and for all practical purposes, they may very well have never come across this particular problem because they have never dealt with this specific research context before. Until that day they do. From the perspective of the academic, they may very well be annoyed that they have to fill in yet another form and make mistakes which lead them to think that the administrative apparatus of the university is burdensome and complicated. Absolutely. Likewise, an administrator may very well be using bureaucratic legalese to obfuscate in order to deal with people that they don't really want to deal with, in order to get rid of them because they're overburdened, they don't have time. Similarly, from the perspective of the academic, their particular inquirer may not be technically eligible for that specific fund or form, and they're testing the boundaries in order to identify if they can get resources here or not, or if they can find any loopholes. And all of these preconditions, they may all very well be the case. So the next slide would then be solidarity. The point here is, and it's very fortunate that this happens to be the theme of this conference, is not only that this is okay, it is okay that people have hidden motives. It's okay that people have technical difficulties. It's okay that people have limited capacities. It's okay that things become a problem when there weren't before. The point of solidarity is that this is a starting point that allows for the constructive resolution of all of these issues. Only if there's a willingness to be helpful, to show solidarity with the other, with people whom we might not initially agree, is there a possibility for constructive problem resolution. If that willingness doesn't exist, then for all practical purposes, it does indeed become impossible, regardless of what the form is. So the next slide would then be something that needs more thinking. Before we go to the question, we just want to raise an additional dimension of this dynamic that we are trying to describe here, which we hitherto have not yet touched upon, and that is the longitudinal dimension of this dynamic. What we're meaning by that is that individuals who become proficient at these types of form filling then climb the institutional hierarchy. On a simplistic level, here we have the Peter principle, in the sense that in hierarchical institutions, individuals are being promoted to the position of their inaptitude, where they rise through the ranks until they occupy a position where they no longer advance, because they do not excel in that position. Furthermore, we also then have the fact that the academics willfully use these bureaucratic processes to settle their own status disputes and or advance their own careers and arguments, in the sense that they may not be able to win an argument intellectually with someone that they disagree. However, they know that the said individual is conducting other questionable activities, and they can lodge a disciplinary inquiry in order to neutralize this individual, or that they can outmaneuver them, that there are not funds available. These are all these types of nuances of office politics that are being fought in those forms and with these forms, and there's always possible deniability because, well, you haven't filled in the form correctly, or there's so much paperwork between. So basically, once again, solidarity is a solution again, also for these willful anti-solidarity actions, because by enduring all of their ill effect temporarily, this ill intention of the assailant can be brought to the surface, in the sense of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, where a consistent established behavior pattern then reveals the duplicit character of these types of individuals. Unfortunately, this means that bureaucracy have to become your friend, as it represents the paper trail that can be used as an evidence base to make these case for a bad faith accusation. So conclusion. So to reiterate, forms and bureaucracy represents a technology of complexity reduction. That complexity reduction can and does lead to normalization, which can cause that some issues will fall outside of the domain of sensitivity and can potentially cause friction and subsequent conflict. The solution is twofold. Firstly, there needs to be a solidarity with engaging with the other on their terms before their complexity can be reduced into a bureaucratic form. Secondly, if there temporarily cannot be agreement, a forgiving and patient attitude can allow time and space to collate and collect evidence, which other more nuanced activities are part of the process that encumbers solidarity formation in the first place. Like I was saying, you are logging these instances of where things didn't work out. And individually, you didn't fill in the form correctly. If that happens 20 times, there's an issue with the administrator, or the other way around, there's an issue with the academic. We argue only by departing from this type of generosity of spirit, and to quote Marcus Aurelius, can we live well even in a palace/bureaucracy, and not to be turned into a cockroach by court politics that are being fought through these bureaucratic mechanization of university administration by university management and the academic leadership. So, questions?
Thank you so much. So I open the floor for questions and comments.
That's a really good question, because let's come back to your previous example, and I would say that there isn't a difference between those at all. These are the same mechanisms. But in the first instance, you have already identified the humanity in it. You have a human face to a bureaucrat, to a bureaucrat, to an administrator, that can help you. They may not know either what is going to be in there in that box for your specific purpose, but in that dialogue that you're having with them, you're concretizing that. And what is problematized, not problem, but the issue that arises here with that funding application is that this becomes a competitive aspect of it. So they can't help you, because if they tell you what to put in the box, then they are being unfair to other ones. So it is this obfuscation there for these things. And here is the only type of like solidarity is learning from others who have already filled in these forms, looking at past funding applications, see what they put into those boxes, and then adapt it for your. It's the notion of solidarity is interesting here, because it extends over the border of, like, here's the information that is being passed, and here's the administrative. So this is the form is the mediating with that. But there's also solidarity between you and all of the other people that have filled in that form as well. So ask a colleague, ask, these types of things, or ask the administrator who've helped with filling in forms for other these. So it's once again, it's bringing that back to that humanity of this collective learning, and this is why we went to the to that thing yesterday in the linguistic department, and one of the academics was saying that I always make a point of go and talk face to face with the administrators, and that's precisely the reason to get that experience and get clues, and that's why I think you can. It has to come from yourself as well. That solidarity in order to establish that. If it's always going to work out, hell no. But this is the way that I see it. Yeah. Definitely is, but to take your framing even further and to drive this home is I have conversations with with academics, and they almost have a form of PTSD of post-traumatic stress of filling in these forms, that they have stopped filling in the forms. I'm not going to put in a funding application for going money to a conference. I just pay out of my own pocket because I don't get it anyway. From the perspective of the administrative monster institution, that's fantastic, because you get the free labor. And
And it's cost efficient.
absolutely, so here the bureaucracy has created a barrier
Yeah.
that is extracting value and all this. However, in real terms, there is chaos in the bureaucracy as well. Forms change, people change. So there is no reason of why you trying something and failing today might not have changed tomorrow. If you don't try, you failed automatically, because you don't even put yourself into the position to succeed because you haven't applied for it. And it's not that this is saying that this is there's humanity in it, because there isn't. It's going through that process again and again and again and being rejected and rejected until you don't.
Interesting. Interesting.
It's coming back to that definition. What does correct here mean? And having the freedom to come to your own division of, well, you know what, I don't deem worth it to put myself through that dehumanizing and cruel protest. I find my ways. Well, that might be very well the correct solution for you, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's the whole about of solidarity is that you have to allow for that as well, allow that spectrum of complexity.
Any question there?
One of the views that I use Latour, and I think about that, is twofold. If we're coming back to that example of the box of funding application, and like not uh, knowing what correctly filling in here means, well, if you go and ask an administrator to help you with filling in this particular form, for all practical purposes, they are non-expert. So by you, quote unquote, filling in the form and then afterwards asking them, did that make sense? And they say yes, well, at least you have convinced one person. You have found an articulation of where this highly complex reality of mishmash that is so difficult to articulate becomes into a coherent form that is communicatable. The next step is it's extending that actor network to influence the university. So it's no longer you're a rogue academic that is basically doing whatever. No. It's you're the academic now that is from this university, and here has the funding department has helped you. Those people have helped you. So more people that are involved in that process, the more widespread the articulation becomes, and that's the real, on the ground, day to day, trivial activity of how impact manifests over time. It is building that actor network. It's building those connections with people, with funders, with all of them.
It forms.
Exactly, they're part of those connections, and that is then what creates the impact. Because after a time, that network is so big that it becomes an influence on reality in itself. the I'm not disagreeing with your characterization here. The, these tension exist, and as you correctly identified, like there's this virtual reality, but call it a virtual reality or simplification. That's it's it's a
Yeah,
different,
sure.
yeah. And like I was saying, there isn't inherently anything wrong with the simplification if that simplification is something that you can stand for.
Yeah, all right.
You get at home and tell your children what you did at work today. You don't tell them each and every detail. You give a simplified version that is representative of what you were okay. And like changing the system on a global basis,
Okay, okay, get your point.
I don't think any individual can do that. But maybe that's not the purpose at all. What if it is enough that you can live with yourself and the people that you interact with, and have a bottom up, find something that is workable for everybody in the process, and then this will lead where it will lead, type of thing, with the simplification that is acceptable to ever. This is kind of like going into this like Habermasian ideal speech situation,
Yes.
but it's not amongst like experts as such. It's amongst people that have different backgrounds, and the reason of why I don't really like that as such is because that it's not stable. Because if the process changed, then the update has to change again and stuff like that. So it's not a stable basis for this is how we can do it always, because it only works contextual in that particular context, within that particular time, with that particular administrator, with that particular individual for their specific purpose. But maybe that's enough. This is where I was going with the whole metaphor of magic. Sufficiently advanced technology is magic, because maybe the organism and the mechanization, the institution, is just too complex. The institution of the university is just too complex for any single individual to understand, because there's this idea of Dunbar's number, of that we can only like keep in like control of like 140 social situation relationships, yeah, and the number doesn't really matter as such, and we can argue if it should be more or less or whatever. But basically, it says there's a cognitive limit of how many, and if you have a university that has like 30,000 people, students and stuff, there is no way you can appreciate that complexity. So here, you know, an appeal to ignorance and an appeal to, oh, we didn't know that, can also be an avenue of solidarity building, because the administrators are, as you were saying, in the same. I don't know how this works. I just fill in the form. So it's this, like, okay, we both have problems here. How can we solve this as humans meeting in this bizarre Kafkaesque situation that we both find ourselves in? Not just one individual, but they're as much in risk of being turned into a cockroach as the academics are. So it's the acknowledging of the vulnerability of everybody in that, being sucked into that, as you were saying correctly, uncaring machine of just seeing if the box fits, type of thing. So.
And join me in thanking that.